So today we're going to wrap up our exploration of the fourth meditation, which we started last lecture. If you were able to watch the last lecture I posted, unfortunately I didn't get to post it till this morning. So if you were looking for it, yesterday or the day before, it wasn't on Blackboard. It was on YouTube, but it wasn't on Blackboard yet. So hopefully you had a chance to watch. But we got a bit of a start on meditation 4. We talked a little bit about, some of the unfinished business from previous meditations. Remember, meditation 3 is concerning God, that he exists. That's the title. At least that's how it's rendered in our translation. And he needs to prove God exists to alleviate his initial skepticism. By the end of the first meditation, he's established this pretty global skepticism, doubting everything. For all he knows, it could all be an illusion. There could be this evil genius. But he knows that the only possibility that an evil genius exists is if God doesn't exist. He doesn't think that those two concepts are compatible. If God exists, then the evil genius hypothesis goes away. And that's why it's so important for him to provide us with the proof for God's existence. He doesn't want to be a skeptic. He wants to be, remember, a rationalist. He's going to use reason to know things. We can know things. It's possible to have knowledge. You don't doubt everything. Knowledge is possible through reason. But again, he can't get to that viewpoint until he dispels the skeptic and dispels the evil genius hypothesis. He thinks he's done that pretty much at this point, but there's one sort of point of unfinished business regarding God that he has to wrap up. And we covered that last time, so I'm not going to spend much time on it now, but I'm referring to God as a deceiver. That will lead us into the topic of discussion today. But it's not good enough to prove God exists. He thinks he's already done that in the third meditation. If you look at the last lecture, we looked at some objections to his proof. Maybe it's not the greatest, but he's satisfied with it. So he's proven that God exists, but he has to also prove that God's not a deceiver. And he provides us with an argument for that at the beginning of meditation 4. I covered that at the end of the lecture last time. Basically, the notion of deception and the notion of God, he believes, are incompatible. If God is perfect, if God is good, then he wouldn't be a deceiver. Deception is the mark of malevolence and imperfection. But this leads to another conundrum, and basically the issue is, well, if God is not a deceiver, then how is it possible that I'm sometimes deceived? I know I'm not always deceived. I don't believe an evil genius, the evil genius theory's gone now. He's put that behind him. There's no way I'm always being deceived, that everything that I think is false. That wouldn't be compatible with a God. God wouldn't allow that. But it's pretty obvious that God allows me to sometimes make mistakes. I make mistakes sometimes. We all make mistakes. And so this is the issue that he is trying to answer in the fourth meditation. Why is it possible for me to make mistakes? You would think that if I was created by God, which he thinks he's established already, that's one of his proofs that we didn't really focus on too much in the last lecture, was kind of like God is the only explanation for my existence. I could appeal to my parents, but what caused them? And then there's this, I don't know if I even want to dwell on it because it's kind of a confusing argument, this argument that something has to sustain me at every moment. I'm not sustaining me. I'm not telling myself, keep existing, keep existing, keep existing. So all things are sustained. The universe, the world is sustained at every moment. So there must be a sustainer, and the only thing that has a power enough to sustain everything at every moment and keep it existing and keep it from not existing, the only thing that has enough power for that would be a God. So that's kind of one of his proofs. If God did create me, though, let's say he is the great sustainer, the great creator of all that is, why did he create me in such a way? Descartes is asking, why did he create me in such a way that I make mistakes? Why do I make errors? Why don't I always make the right choice? Why don't I always have the correct knowledge? And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this at the end of the last lecture, if you saw it. This is, to my knowledge, the least controversial presentation of the problem of evil in the history of Western philosophy. The problem of evil is a very important problem. Philosophers still debate it today. You can take a whole semester in the problem of evil at some universities, in some philosophy departments. But the way that Descartes poses this problem is very innocent. I kind of like that, because usually people get really upset, and I guess, trigger warning, some of you might feel a bit uncomfortable about the discussion today. And so the way he presents it, I kind of like that it's not controversial for that reason. I think that the fact that it's uncomfortable to talk about makes people not think rationally in the discussion of it. On the other hand, I think in a way he's kind of avoiding some of the more important questions. The problem of evil, and I defined it, or I explained it at the end of the last lecture, but just to review, the idea is, look, if God is perfect, and there is this perfect God that is just and all-powerful and all-knowing, then why does evil exist? And not just evil, but just anything bad. Why do bad things happen in the universe? Why, for instance, why do earthquakes come and kill people? Why do innocent people suffer and good people good people suffer, innocent people suffer, and sometimes really bad people don't suffer? They actually sometimes are rewarded. Why is there injustice in this world? And so that's typically how the problem is posed. But Descartes, again, he's kind of keeping it innocent. He's just like, why do I make errors? Why do I make mistakes? He mentions, remember he was giving the example in the last meditation of the two ideas I have of the sun. One of them is drawn from experience, and I feel the sun is much closer than it actually is. And one is from my intellect and my understanding, where I understand that the sun is much further away and much larger than it appears to my senses. And so I made a mistake if I thought that the way that the sun was, I made an error, and we constantly make errors like this. We constantly make mistakes. If God created me and designed me the way I am, why didn't he make me such that I don't make these mistakes, and then I'm always correct in my judgments of what I see? Descartes needs to come up with an explanation for this, but he has to avoid blaming God for any of this deception. Can't be God's fault. He said that deception is incompatible with a perfect divine being. So we can't blame God for it, but yet we have to explain it. So we have to come up with what's called in philosophy a theodicy. I've got that word up there on the screen. A theodicy is a theory that is supposed to explain the presence of imperfection in the universe, evil, bad stuff happening in the universe. Explain that without attributing it to God, without blaming God for it. It's literally theos is the Greek word for God. Dice means something like put a mandate, give a stamp of approval, validate, something like this. So it's a theory that sort of explains the reason for suffering, evil, bad stuff, without blaming God. You've got to have some explanation for it, but you can't blame God. So does anybody, perhaps, I see Dylan, you got your hand raised. Perhaps you might have some explanation. There's several different ways you can approach this, but you had maybe a question or a comment, or one way you might approach the problem of evil?
I don't have any explanations for the way to, well, I don't have, not to answer your question, but I was just making sure. So theology is just, it's explaining evil without referring to God.
Right, it's a way of kind of justifying evil in the universe. Bad stuff happens. Obviously, sometimes bad stuff does happen. Why does it happen? You have to explain why it happens, and this is, you know, the word theodicy was coined later than Descartes, but that's just sort of a technical term we use in philosophy. It's really, you could use it much broader. You could use it in a broader sense, just any way to explain evil. Why does evil exist in the universe? But typically, within this sort of tradition, we try to avoid blaming that on God. God. If God is good and perfect, why would God be the source of something imperfect? This kind of ties in, to Descartes' use of the principle of sufficient reason. Remember, he says that a thing that's created must have a reason for why it is, and whatever made it, whatever created it, whatever caused it, whatever reason has to be enough. So if it's something that is like me, I'm a thinking thing, whatever created me also has to be a thinking thing. So whatever is then the effect, there has to be some of it in the cause. In fact, more of it in the cause. So he's going to say, look, if God is perfect and God is good, he can't really be the cause of anything bad. And yet, bad stuff happens. So how do I explain bad stuff? How do I explain mistakes? How do I explain evil stuff, like bad stuff in the universe? What sort of theodicies are available to us, do you think? He's got a reply, but I'm curious, what, anybody have any ideas how you might explain, why does God allow bad, evil, etc. to happen,
My explanation would just be out of human free will. Because if we're looking at the Bible and from Christian terminology, we refer to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
So a couple things. Let me try to keep. Oh, geez. Now my screen is freezing up. I think my computer just can't handle it when things get interesting. But yeah, free will is pretty much the answer that Descartes gives us. But I'm still waiting for my buffering signal to stop. It's weird. I can see my webcam. I can see I'm moving, but the rest of the screen is frozen. But yeah, free will. I'm assuming you guys can hear me or whatever, and everything else is going fine. But free
we
will.
can see you.
Yeah, so free will is probably, to me, I would say, the strongest theodicy. Now, really, none of these are perfect. None of them are perfect, but free will would probably have to be the best one. And this is the way Descartes goes about it. He says, well, what is the cause of my errors? Why do I make mistakes? He basically he concludes that the reason he makes mistakes is because his what he calls his judgment extends beyond his understanding. So he makes a judgment about something he doesn't really understand. His judgment, and what allows him to do that is his free will. So, and again, he's being very innocent here. He's talking about making a mistake on a math problem, or making a mistake thinking the sun is closer than it is or smaller than it is. But even when it comes to evil, you mentioned Adam and Eve. I guess the idea is, there's a few, depending on what flavor of Christianity, what denomination. There's different ways to interpret that story. But the idea is that, in the Garden of Eden, and this might even be a little different, so we can maybe think of this as maybe a slightly different theodicy, but I'm trying to tie it into what you said about free will, that Adam and Eve, I guess the idea was they eat the apple from the tree of knowledge, and that gives them knowledge of good and evil. But that allows them to be good, but also bad. And some would interpret that in the Garden of Eden, there really is no good or evil. It's not until that act, and that's when good and evil is introduced into the world. Now, that's again, not all Christians think of that story from Genesis the same way, but that's one interpretation of it. But I guess the idea is that, and this is again not every person who's Christian is going to think this way, but like people like Saint Augustine, for instance, he's an early Christian. He had a sort of reading of Genesis to this effect that the idea is that if there were no evil, if Adam and Eve had never sinned or whatnot, and that kind of thing, there really would be. It's not that there wouldn't be good. I don't think Augustine would say that the Garden of Eden wasn't good. It was good, but that there is a greater good that is the result of the fact that we have the choice, the fact that we're capable of choosing right or wrong. It makes our choice better, or it gives it more dignity, or it holds us more responsible for it, and therefore more worthy of reward or more worthy of punishment if we don't use our freedom correctly. So that's one way, and I'm thinking that's maybe what you had in mind, Dylan, when you were talking about free will in the Christian context, the Garden of Eden. But then there's another, and this is kind of slightly different, I think. This is kind of where Descartes coming from. Although you could argue Descartes is influenced by what you're thinking about. He might think he's being independent, but maybe he's influenced by his own upbringing, etc. But he thinks that free will, the ability to, and what he means by freedom in this context is just the ability to understand different choices, different ways of interpreting the world, different ideas, and choosing amongst which ones you're going to agree to and disagree to. It's a matter of intellectual assent or descent, right? I'm not going to agree, so that for him, free will is just a matter of using your mind to either agree or disagree with certain things. It's sort of a control of your belief, and he believes that that is how we are made in God's image. So when the Jewish and Christian tradition say that we are made in God's image, that quote from I think from Genesis, or no, I think it's Talmudic, but I forget, but whatever. The tradition that we're made in God's image, that's what is meant by that, according to Descartes, is that the fact that we have free will is what allows us to somewhat understand the divine being. Let me find the passage where he says this, because it's quite, when you first think about it, you're thinking he's making quite a bold claim, but he tries to explain himself, because he's saying that when it comes to free will, that we have just as much, no more, no less than God does himself. Now, God has more power and more wisdom, Descartes says, so he's able to use his free will better and with more wisdom, and he's got more power, so he can do more with it. But as far as just the ability to agree or disagree, or understand or misunderstand, like that sort of intellectual freedom, he thinks is equal. It's the same. We all have just as much as anybody else. In a way, this reminds me a bit of Sartre. We're going to get to Sartre later in the semester. Sartre was an atheist, but he was much like Descartes in this regard. He thought of free will in this way. Sartre once said that a man who's being executed in his handcuffs is just as free as you and I are here. Sure, he can't do much with his freedom. He's chained up, but he can hold his head high. He can cower. He can beg for, mercy or whatever. He's got that sort of freedom. Yeah, Dylan, you had a question or a point you wanted to?
Oh yeah, I know we went over it when we first started going over Renee. When we first started going over him. But yeah. What was his upbringing again, and what was his framework from?
Well, he's still a member of the church, right? He's still pretty. At least he says he is, and that's how he writes. He's a member of the French Catholic Church. You know, he's not living in Germany where there's still, you know, where the Protestants are starting to rise up. You know, when he's writing this, he's you know, he's talking about theological concepts, but I think this is also partly why he tries to just keep it real non-controversial and just talk about making mistakes at math. And he's not talking about like ethical issues, like, you know, why do people suffer injustice? Because he was very much like the church needs to deal with those issues. You know, the church, they're the ones that are in charge of value and what's right or wrong and ethics. I just want to do physics, Descartes. You know, I want to do math. I want to do physics. I want to do geometry, natural science. And we need to kind of keep these questions separate. And so he's dabbling in, I guess you could say he's dabbling in theology because he feels like he just has to prove that God exists to get rid of his skepticism, right? I show that God exists. I explain why I make errors. It's because of my free will. And then once I'm aware of the source of my errors, I can kind of control and make sure I don't make those errors. But as far as like his upbringing, yeah, he was definitely, you know, a member of the church. He considered himself devout. You know, if you read the introduction, we skip the introduction, but he writes in the introduction, it's actually kind of useful. The introduction, he summarizes everything. You know, it doesn't really make sense if you haven't read the essay, because, you know, he goes through it so quickly, but he kind of summarizes all 6 meditations, and he claims that he's writing this essay in defense of the church, that all these, you know, scientists and even theologians like Martin Luther, you know, they're attacking the authority of the church, and he claims to be, you know, sort of defending it and showing that, look, I just want to do my science. I just want to do my math problems. You don't have to worry about me. I'm a good church boy. We need to keep these sort of things separate. Ironically, though, the church did not like his writings, and this book, I don't know if it still is, but it was on the list of banned books by the church. The church did not want people reading the meditations. I think it's probably because the first 2 or 3 meditations, especially the first 2, are, I think, way more convincing than the rest of it. So he's really good at getting you to be skeptical. He's not quite as convincing at getting you to come back to sort of reality, I suppose. And maybe that's sort of my take on it. But yeah, he's definitely, you also have to keep in mind, though, Dylan, it's not just his religious upbringing that probably has him, you know, somewhat biased, but also he's still, whether he wants to admit it or not, he's also using some ideas that you can trace back to Greek philosophy. You know, he wants to act like, you know, I'm wiping the slate clean. I'm starting from scratch. I'm going to start with all I know for sure. I exist, work my way out from that, and then I can sort of learn about all the rest of things like science and the world around me and other things. But some would question whether he really is able to do that. Is he really able to start from scratch? Or is he also sneaking in some biases, some previous philosophies? You know, this is definitely a question. This is maybe something you could look to if you're going to critique him in your paper. You know, this would be a good critique. Let's come back to this free will theodicy in just a moment. I'm curious, though, if anybody has any other answers to the question, though. Are there other ways of explaining evil besides free will? Because it seems, the problem with the free will argument to me seems that even if you account for free will, doesn't like there's like really bad stuff happens that people still don't seem to deserve. Like, why does, like, child abuse, you know, why does a child get abused? Why doesn't God come in and intervene and prevent evil from happening, you know, to children? Or you know, think, you could say, well, that's the free will of the person abusing them. Yeah, but couldn't have God stopped them? Or even, like I mentioned, natural disasters. You know, why did God allow that tsunami to kill that whole village? That doesn't seem like free will. that seems like it was nature. And if God created nature, then why did God create nature to do this? You could be a real hardliner on this. Yeah, Dylan, you had something to say about that? You want to add something?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my rebuttal against that, why does the common question, why does good things happen to bad people?
Yeah.
I really believe that God doesn't necessarily just let it happen. He'll give warnings, he'll give signs. However, it consistently goes back to our free will. I don't know if I'm circular talking or not,
Well,
but
I think no, you're right. No, in fact, that's kind of where I was gonna go. You're saying it much nicer though. I think. Usually, like, I remember when I don't even know how many years ago it was. There was a big tsunami, earthquake in Haiti that killed all those people. And there was this guy, I think it was, I always get them mixed up, whether it was Pat Robertson or who's the other guy? Well, he was one of the televangelists, and he said that the reason that the Haitians died was that God was punishing them because they had made a deal with the devil in the 1800s in order to get rid of the French colonialist or something like that. So that's kind of like a very horrible thing to say. I think he also said something like 9/11 was we were being punished. America, United States, was being punished on 9/11 because we were too tolerant of homosexuality or something like this. I can't remember what he said, something to that effect. So yeah, but he's gonna be like, yeah, it's all our fault, right? Like, and God gave us warnings, ahead of time, and it's our fault that, yeah, I mean, maybe that's true, but that kind of seems to make God pretty like, wow, like, don't mess with this dude. And also, like, what about people like, I mean, the children, like, are they supposed to know the signs? Like, I mean, like, their parents might be able to know the signs and be like, okay, well, God is making a trembling noise because we're not being good, so we need to start being good, or whatnot. But it gets complicated. I still think, though, to be fair, the free will is theodicy is probably the least problematic. There are other ones that I'm surprised no one's jumped in with anything else. But yeah, Dylan, you wanted to add something else?
Yeah, I would agree with him. However, I wouldn't use the term punishment. I'll see more as a allowance or wrath. I mean, even though wrath and punishment is pretty much the same thing.
I was
but,
going to say, like, you change the word. It's like, if my mom or dad died in that earthquake, I'd still be pretty, like, whether you called it wrath or punishment, I'd still be pretty much like, well, geez, So, and I was kind of getting to this earlier. I totally, like I sometimes do, I lost my thread talking about free will. But you mentioning the Garden of Eden kind of also made me think there's another theodicy, is that I don't know how I would explain this or write it in one word, but I alluded to it earlier, and I'm getting it from Saint Augustine. I don't know if he's the one that invented it, but I that's where I got it from. But Saint Augustine said something like, God allowed, he didn't, he's not the cause of evil, but he allows evil to happen so that a greater good can rise. And so I guess the idea is that if everything was like the Garden of Eden, it would be good, sure, but it wouldn't be as good because everything's already given to you. Everything is already there. And so there's no chance to be brave. There's no chance to be a hero if there's no evil to fight against, if there's no adversary. Um, there's a famous book from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, from the books of wisdom in the Torah, the book of Job, and some of y'all probably are familiar with the story. So Job is Job, right? Job is this man who is very holy or pious, or however you want to put it, and in the beginning of the book, God is having this conversation with the devil, with Satan, And in fact, I think it might be one of the earliest references to Satan in the Bible. But the Satan is talking to God, and they're looking down on Job, down on earth, and Satan says, well, look at Job. He's really a very faithful, devout servant of yours. And God says, yes, he is a very good man. And the devil says, yeah, but look, he's got everything he needs. He's got a beautiful wife and family and all these kids. And he's got a big farm with a bunch of livestock and plants. And he's doing really well. It's pretty easy to love you if everything's going so great. I bet, Satan is telling God, he says, I bet I could get him to curse you. I bet I could get him to speak ill of you. And God says he would never do that. He's a good man. I know he wouldn't do that. And the devil says, oh yeah, I bet I could get him to do it. And God says, well, give it a shot. Go ahead. I give you my permission. I allow you to cause evil to Job. And so he does. The devil goes down and causes havoc. God says, you can't kill him, but you mess with him. So the devil, I think, he makes all of his children get really, really sick and die, and then his same thing with his wife, and then his crops fail, and then he gets really sick, and he starts to feel pain and suffering, and he's agonizing. But just like God said, of course, he doesn't break. He's very confused. He wants a theodicy, right? He wants an explanation. Why, God? Why? And his neighbors are his friends, or I can't really tell who it is. These three men who are just sort of standing there. They're kind of mocking Job, and they're laughing and pointing and telling him he's a fool, and that he is being punished for something, that he did something wrong. And he says, I swear I follow the law. I follow the commandments. I don't know what I did wrong. I'm very devout. And they're like, no, you did something. You just forgot. You just overlooked something. You must have done something. God would not punish you if you didn't deserve it. And all this sort of talk. Well, finally, at the end of the book, God shows up and talks to Job, and he tells Job that they were wrong, and that no, he is good and he's not being punished and all this. And then Job is like, well, what's all this about? Why did all this stuff happen? And is anybody familiar with the story? Do you know the answer? Why was he? What did God tell Job? He didn't tell him I had a bet with the devil. That's not what he says. In fact, I suspect, because if you read it, I'm not a scholar. I don't read Hebrew, so I don't know but if you read most translations, the writing style is different. I suspect that the intro with Satan and him having a bet, I suspect that was added later by, during like the time of Ezra the scribe or something, because it doesn't really stylistically fit in. But do you know the answer, Dylan? You remember what does God tell Job at the end of all his sufferings?
I don't remember the final speech, but I know I'm looking at the New Living Translation, so it's the modern Bible. I'm not really too familiar with the Hebrew Bible, but however, I do see
the Hebrew Bible's just that's what you refer to. Christians call the Old Testament the Hebrew Bible sometimes. It was written in Hebrew. But yeah, like what were you gonna say though? You got the
I know it's chapter 27 verses 19 and 20. It says the wicked go to bed rich, but wake to find that all their wealth is gone. Terror overwhelms them like a flood, and they are blown away in the storms of the night. Right. So like my standpoint behind that is, what does it do to gain the whole world and lose your soul? Or what does it do to have materialistics and don't be happy?
Right. Yeah, that's a nice passage you got there though. But the passage, it's very long. I mean I don't have to go pull it off the shelf to get my copy of the Bible. But the passage where God shows up it's actually really beautiful. It's very poetic. And that passage you just read, I like your reading of it. I like your interpretation of it. But the way I read it, right, is, and I think that maybe I'm not saying that what you said is wrong. I think, in fact, it actually just adds to what I'm about to say. Um, but it's sort of like, and I don't know if I like this answer. It actually, the way I'm going to explain it probably doesn't sound as good as it does, obviously, in the book. It's actually one of the, I think, the better books in the Bible, as far as the literary merit. It's very well written, kind of poetic. But it's sort of like, well, he talks about how he created all the heavens and the earth. He mentions the Leviathan and the Behemoth, right? These great monster, the behemoth that lurks, or Leviathan that lurks at the bottom of the depths of the ocean, that will one day rise and you know uh, cast judgment on all the evildoers, etc. And basically, and there are other readings of this, but I mean, to me, the obvious reading is at the end of the work. Job is basically told, look, I'm God, and you were a very small part of this incredible creation of mine. I separated the light from the dark, and I created the stars in the sky, and I set all this in motion, and I did all these things. And basically, this kind of sounds condescending, but of course it is God. He's the greatest being ever, apparently. But he basically says, look, there is a reason. There is a reason for why you suffer. But there is no way to explain it to you that you will understand. That there's a certain thing about, being human. You're not perfect. I am, right? I'm the creator of all there is. I am the perfect being. And so there are things that I will do that you will not get. You're not going to understand them. And they are right. And this theodicy, this way of looking at things, is, I don't find it that satisfactory. It sounds cool when you read it in the book of Job because it's so well written. But I feel like if somebody told me, well, there's actually a good reason why I let all these things happen that are horrible to you, like you lost your family and all this stuff. There's a good reason, but I can't explain it to you. Just trust me. Um, I think that if I had gone through a personal tragedy like that, I'd find that hard to swallow, even if it were true. Um, but in a way, this is kind of denying that there really is evil, that there really is the existence of evil. All there is really the perception of evil. And I guess I should add, if you read the story, at the very end of it, I think he does, God gives him back, well, doesn't give him back, he gets a new wife and a new family, or he's restored his health and all this stuff, and etc. But yeah, Dylan, you want to add something before I move on to the next thing?
Oh yeah, that's my bad. I had read a separate chapter. My apologies. You were talking about the very last.
Yeah, the very end. Yeah, the very end. Yeah,
my apologies. My apologies.
Yeah, and that's the longer one, and he goes on, and like I said, it's really pretty, but it's pretty much. I think if you try to encapsulate it, it's sort of like, well, look, there is a reason. It's unexplainable. And there's an interesting. I think it's Spinoza was the philosopher. I can't know for sure. I can't remember for sure. But Spinoza, I think he uses this metaphor or this analogy. He compares it to staring at a tapestry in a museum. So if you don't know what a tapestry is, for those of you who don't know, it's basically like a really fancy rug. It's all made of of some sort of fabric, yarn, string, and it's usually very beautiful. They're very intricate. They're either some sort of patterns or sometimes an image, an actual, like it looks like a painting sometimes. They're very detailed. But again, it's just a tapestry. It's a a fancy rug, basically, hanging on a wall. So Spinoza says, imagine you're looking at a beautiful tapestry and you're standing, 10 or 15 feet away so you can see the whole tapestry, and it's the most beautiful tapestry that you've ever seen, and there's nothing wrong with it. You can't imagine how you could change it any way to make it any better. You couldn't change one of the threads or any of the yarn at all. All the colors, all the way it's organized, absolutely perfect masterpiece. Well, if you step up to the tapestry and you put your face like this, like right up to it, and you're staring at just one little square, is it going to look like a perfect masterpiece? No, it'll probably look like chaos. It'll probably look like just a bunch of random strands of yarn. So the argument is that the divine being, God, is able to see the entire universe and creates it in a way in which it is absolutely perfect. But we're only able to see a glimpse, a section, a part, and so our perception of it is going to be imperfect. And so sometimes when we see, a tragedy, it looks horrible. All these people died, but if we step back in the grander scheme of things, it was actually good that happened. That was actually brought about a better good. Personally, though, so that's sort of, I don't know. I would say it's a mystery, right? There's a reason for evil things, but we don't understand the reason. Only God knows the reason. And honestly, if we knew the reason, some argue there really is no evil at all. It's not evil. It's just perceived as evil. It just looks evil from our perspective. If we saw the whole universe, we'd say, actually, it was good that horrible massacre happened. To me, this is hard to swallow. But again, I only can see the massacre. I'm like, how is it that, that school shooting was good, right? To me, I don't know. I find this unsettling, right? The idea is like, well, if it didn't happen, then a worse school shooting would have happened, or it brought about awareness of the problem, and then like the problem would have been worse otherwise, or something like this. Like, maybe it's true, but I still find it unsettling. Sort of, there's a character in one of Dostoevsky's novels. There's a Russian novelist. He was Christian too, by the way, but he thought this was a bad problem, and he was trying to deal with it in one of his novels, The Problem of Evil. And one of the characters in his book, this doesn't really sit well with him either. His brother is, very devout. His brother Alyosha is trying to tell him, oh, it's okay, all this suffering, because in the end, it's all going to work out. And he says, well, I don't care if it's all going to work out. Can't we just make it a less perfect painting? Can't we make it just a less perfect world without the suffering? And yeah, this is a difficult issue, I think, to grapple with, right? Yeah, Dylan, you had something you wanted to add to that?
Oh yeah, one statement and also one question. So I start the statement. So also, I forgot it real quick. But I know the question I had was,
Yeah.
What are some ways that that free will is usually contradicted?
Well, free will, to me, the arguments against it basically are the deterministic argument, right? So the idea that you have free will is the idea that, well, okay, so I go to the ice cream store and let's say I go to 31 flavors and I pick chocolate, because I like chocolate. So I say, well, darn it, I got free will. Who's going to tell me that that I don't have the choice? I made that choice. But then the person who's the determinist is going to say, yeah, but did you decide to like chocolate? Were you the one? Did you say, I'm going to decide that I like chocolate? Like, there's certain foods you like, and there's certain foods you just don't like. You eat, I don't like mint. I just never liked it as a kid. Right now, I think what screwed me up might have been my experience of, I don't know if you ever had those York peppermint patties, but I remember seeing a commercial for those York peppermint patties as a kid, and I imagine they tasted a lot different than they actually did. I thought they tasted like Almond Joy or Mounds or something. So when I got the York and I ate it and it tasted all minty, I was like, gross, right? But again, the idea is you don't decide what you like. You don't decide what you want. You just want it. You have desires for certain things. And that you're going to say, oh, yeah, but still, I have the ability to control my desire. So like I might have a craving for that chocolate ice cream, but I'm trying to count my calories so I can lose some weight. So I'm going to think about, cutting back my calories. But then the person that's a determinist is going to say, yeah, why do you want to cut your calories? It's probably because, you feel like you're overweight and you didn't decide to feel that way. Society pressured you, or somebody, like this girl that you like, you want to make you look better, you try to make her think you're more attractive or whatever it is. But the idea is that all the things that happen are determined by preceding causes, including your decisions. And you don't know what you're going to think before you think it. It just happens. One thought precedes the other. And if your actions are determined by your thoughts, then and your thoughts are just determined by who knows what, by your genetics, by something external, you're reacting to the environment. So that's the basic argument for determinism against free will. If you ask me, I'm sort of with Kant. Kant doesn't really think you can prove or disprove free will or determinism, really, at least in the way that we're talking about it. Even if, there's some neuroscientists today who are very much against free will. They don't think it's real because, and their argument is, I can predict what you're going to do before you do it. I can look at a brain scan and I can see, based on your brain patterns, I know a second before you do something, I know you're going to do it because of your brain patterns. And so you're determined to do it by your physiology. But to me, I don't know if that really defeats free will. I think that that's just because you're able to predict something doesn't necessarily mean it was determined to happen that way. And, what caused that brain pattern, right? You're assuming that that brain pattern was caused by something external, not by the individual themselves. And I'm agreeing with them. If I'm a scientist, I would keep looking for causes. But if you're a philosopher, I don't really think that that completely defeats free will, because the people that believe in free will also believe in a soul or a self, typically, and that's a very metaphysical concept. So, I could say, well, what causes the brain pattern is my soul or myself. This, what Kant would call the noumenal self. One issue, and this is an issue, I don't know if we should even bring up this because we're already kind of getting sidetracked. This is fun, though, by the way, so I'm not all that concerned. Well, one issue, too, that comes up in this context, in the context of theology and these sort of questions, is, how do you explain free will and God's plan? The idea that God has a plan for everything, or also that God has foreknowledge of everything. God knows what you're going to do before you do it. If God knows what you're going to do before you even do it, that seems like you were determined to do it. And so you didn't really have a choice. And so, you were going to have a turkey sandwich for lunch, and God knew you were going to have a turkey sandwich for lunch. Maybe you want to try to trick him and be like, I'm going to have a turkey salami sandwich. But God knew you were going to change your mind at the last minute. So some of the earlier Christians, I keep mentioning Augustine. He's the one that deals with free will quite a bit and problem of evil, at least the one I'm more familiar with. He deals with this problem. How is it that God knows what I'm going to do before I do it, and yet I'm still free? I could change at any moment. And his solution is basically that God is able to see all time at once. That we don't experience time very rationally. We don't experience time the same way that God experiences time. God is somehow beyond time and space and outside of time and space, and so God can see all time and space at once. The way that we experience this very moment, it's always the moment. It's always the present. The past doesn't exist anymore. The future doesn't exist yet. That's how we experience time. It's always now. And for Augustine, he says that leads to all sorts of contradictions and confusions and paradoxes. So it's really not that the time is the way we experience time is not properly correct. The proper experience of time is the way that God experiences it all at once. So we do have free will. All our choices are our own, but we've already made them. Like we've already made them before. We just don't know yet. We're experiencing them from moment to moment. God has already seen them sort of work themselves out. I think that's kind of the novel solution. There are some problems with it, but I don't want to go into them because it's kind of off topic. Um, well, I notice I'm running out of time. Speaking of time, I did not intend it to. That's kind of a good segue. I'm running out of time, so let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything here. I was hoping we would get to meditation 5 today. That's okay that we didn't. We can cover that in the next lecture. We did get through the main points of meditation 4, but let me make sure. I think there's one more theodicy that I'm forgetting here. I'm surprised no one else has come up with this one. So free will, that's a good one. And I guess I should explain. Descartes, his main argument for why it's good to have free will is, again, it's what connects us to God. It's what makes us in God's image, and it's better to have free will and be capable of error than to not have free will and not be capable of error. He just thinks that is just intuitive. And I think kind of is, but in a selfish way. It's sort of like, yeah, I want free will. If you said, do you want to be a robot or do you want to have free will? I'd be like, yeah, free will, please. I want to be responsible for my actions. But is that like my ego? Just I want control? Maybe the universe would be a better universe if we were all pre-programmed by God to be good and never do bad things to each other. Maybe that would be better. But he's assuming no, that it's better to be capable of mistakes and be free than to be incapable of mistakes but not be free. So that's the sort of trade-off. And so that's how error is possible. That's how things go wrong, is because of our free will. But it's the price we pay for having that special faculty, as he describes it. The Mystery Theodicy is one that he doesn't mention at all. I brought it up. It's another popular approach, right? There is a reason for all the evil in the universe. There's a good reason for it. It's just there's no way that human beings can comprehend it. The last one, and there's others, there's many others, but these are sort of the main ones. And like I said, we're almost out of time. So I got to kind of wrap it up. The other one, and I'm surprised no one kind of mentioned this, some say that, well, evil is a test. Right? It's a test that God has to test us. The idea is that if we aren't capable of evil and we're only capable of good, then it doesn't make sense to be rewarded or punished. That punishment or reward only makes sense if you are responsible for your actions, right? And so if you're not capable of doing bad stuff, then if we all lived in a Garden of Eden scenario and everybody, I'm sort of using the Christian framework here, and this, as far as I know, this theodicy is almost always used in a Christian or Muslim or Jewish context. I don't know how like a Buddhist or Hindu would deal with this. I think Hindus would say, like, I know there's like a section from the Mahabharata where one of the warriors doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to go on the battlefield to fight because he respects the enemy, because many of the enemies were former friends of his and former trainers. And he's like, I'm not going to go kill them. I love him. He was my uncle's buddy or whatever. He, taught me how to shoot this bow and arrow, and I don't want to go kill him. And then like Krishna tells him, he's like, it is your duty. You are a warrior. You must, this is a test. And yes, you must fight, and it's sad. You must, kill people that you respect, but you're doing your duty. And if you do this, you will be rewarded, right? You will be reborn as a higher type of being. You'll be reincarnated as a greater, more wise and enlightened being. So it's kind of a similar thing. But the idea is, if everything was just given to you like Job at the beginning of the story of Job, then he wouldn't really deserve the reward that he gets. So but to me, this still is kind of problematic, because it seems like, what if one of my, I don't have any children, but imagine I have a kid, or, or just, a nephew, let's say, or a niece, a young child who I love. Imagine they die, they get cancer or something like that. Um, you're going to tell me that was a test? That was to test my faith? That seems kind of messed up. Like, that seems like, why did you make them suffer to test me? So the whole it's a test theodicy is not perfect either. None of these are absolutely perfect. I guess that's why you can take a whole semester discussing this problem, and probably why we took a whole entire class period to discuss the problem. Um, of course, it took me forever to get started because of the stupid technical difficulties at the beginning. But I better stop it there. Right? I think we talked even more about this than I had even intended. But it was fun, and I hope everyone else enjoyed it. It wasn't just me and Dylan just shoot ideas off each other. But anyways, as I said, let me repeat real quick. Next week on Tuesday at 11, we'll do a lecture on Meditation 5. That won't take too long, so it'll probably bleed into the final meditation, meditation 6. And 1 week from today, we'll totally wrap things up with Descartes at 1 p.m. This time next week on Thursday. So I'm going to go ahead and stop. I'm going to hit stop on the record.